Hi everyone, and welcome to our channel Rack to Run, where we discuss with industry leaders topics around AI infrastructure and data centers. And joining us today is Philip Wong from KPMG. So Philip, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Juan. Good to
Sure,
be on with everyone.
sure, Philip. So Philip, how are enterprises adjusting their digital infrastructure strategies in order to meet the demands of AI workloads?
Yeah, it's very interesting, right? So, as enterprises move from initial experimentation and then uses of AI, right, and to more pervasive use of AI, agentic AI, start to see the workload or type of workload changes, right? Moving more and more from large computation to closer and closer to the edge, right, in order to reduce latency, drive speed, right, in terms of computation as well as storage. Now, another interesting thing we see developing is the models themselves are also advancing, right? If you look at some of the recent release by OpenAI and other model providers, right, they're now starting to also provide multitude of models. Some are for targeted for different tasks, right? So the computation requirements of those are now changing as well, right? Meaning some of the models can actually be run in smaller locations, smaller set of computation resources closer to the client customers. The other thing that we now also seeing is some of the enterprise, especially the ones who are more sophisticated and advances, are now creating their own small language models, right, that are trained and learn in the context, whether it's the process or the organization. Some of these models can actually even run on devices, right? So all these changes and advances in models and different types of models, different types of use cases and workload is going to drive a more, I'll say, distributed use of digital infrastructure, right? Certainly the hyperscaler, the large computation, right, is continued to be required, but you see more and more of the workload getting distributed to the edge, in some cases on devices as well, right? So as an organization thinking about investments, right, thinking about the portfolio of computation resources you need to take into account, right, types of workload and the types of models and the types of latency requirements that you need. Right? Now, one of the things that also shouldn't be overlooked is the data. Right? A lot of these models are going to be continue to be fed by data through vector databases, through different forms of ways to inject data into the AI systems or agentic systems, right? All those will also need to be considered, right, as part of the overall infrastructure strategy.
Great, Philip. And what are the main cost and regulatory considerations when investing in AI capable data centers today, from your point of view?
Yeah, so two types, right? From first and foremost, if you are like data center operators or hyperscalers who are actually investing in the physical infrastructure, right? There's certainly a lot of costs that are still tied to the acquisition of the land, the construction or the permitting that's required, and then on top of that, the connectivity, the power, and then the actual equipment that needs to be outfitted right into the data center itself. So all those are part of the overall cost, right? That's why a lot of these data centers cost a lot of money, right? And in today's environment, starting to see some constraints, right? Whether it's constraint of sourcing power or getting power connected to these sites, or supply chain constraints, right? Whether it's just availability of GPUs, availability, in some cases, construction materials, right? And logistically getting those materials onto those sites, right? All those are actually driving up some of the costs of building a data center. Now, the interesting part is on the enterprise side, who are users of these computation and storage, you're seeing actually a lot of competition, right? From the hyperscalers and some of the GPU as a service providers providing computation resources or storage resources. And that actually has driven down some of the per unit cost, right, of those storage and computation. But then the other side is the demand is rising, right? The number of tokens, the number of users, especially with agentic systems, especially with reasoning AI, that's driving up also the usage as well, right? So from an enterprise perspective, a lot of the cost is around managing the computation and managing the storage costs, right? From a regulatory perspective, it comes back to permitting. It comes back to
Yeah.
working with the local communities and utilities to get access to power, right? And those are the ones that are really regulatory hurdles, right, that a lot of the folks who are building data centers then they need to overcome.
Yeah. Philip, how do you see the role of public-private partnerships evolving in the development of national AI infrastructure?
Yeah, with the current administration, right, there's a lot of focus to make sure US maintaining the lead, right, in AI, whether it's the core research, the advances in frontier models, and also the usage of AI. Right? So hence, at the federal level, there's a lot of attention to drive and incentivize the deployment of large data centers, right? Whether it's Department of Energy starting to look at freeing up potential land, right, or fast tracking permitting to access to different forms of energy, or two, the famous sort of Stargate, right, $500 billion of investment that is trying to recruit different investors and companies to really help build massive hyperscaler data centers. But I'm also seeing at the local level, right, certain jurisdictions, certain areas providing, whether it's incentives or tax relief, or making sure permitting and communities in support, right, of building data centers, right. So both at the federal level and at the state and local jurisdiction level, we're starting to see a lot of activities, a lot of support, right, for data centers, and which is again based on where we are in terms of the promise of Gen AI and agentic AI, the kinds of users now we're seeing, not only from an enterprise perspective, but also consumers, and now working into a lot of the consumer devices and consumer applications. You do see the demand coming. So a lot of these regulatory or PPP, public-private partnerships, and the incentives are actually really trying to help, right, to make sure US maintaining the lead in both users and research.
Yeah, sure. And Philip, from an advisory perspective, what key metrics do you think that companies should monitor when evaluating AI infrastructure investments?
Yeah, and I'm going to sort of, again, answer it in sort of two ways, right? From the perspective of data center operators or hyperscalers, right? The big thing is during the construction phase, during the phase where you're actually building out data centers, given the complexity and the scale, a lot of these constructions, right, and a lot of these projects, just keeping track of cost, timing, coordinating all these different parts, whether it's connectivity, whether it's connections and access to energy sources and utilities, and then all the materials that are showing up at the site for construction, and as well as the labor component, coordinating all that, managing the timing, right? Because the sooner you can outfit a data center and put it online, that's where the revenue comes, right? So managing that whole construction part, managing that whole program, right, to bring these data center capacity online is a big part, right? And then after that, you're just trying to again recruit customers and make sure your yield or your fuel rate, right, is as projected, right? So that's from a data center operator perspective. From an enterprise perspective, what is very interesting is right now we are moving from the stage of experimentation, or it's a novelty, everybody should do it, right, to now some of the cost is actually starting to become a material part, right, of whether it's IT budgets or technology budgets, right, for enterprise, right. So some of the try and true practices in terms of cloud FinOps, right, trying to manage the actual demand, the workload, who gets to use it, the governance around it. And then, as I mentioned, it's not just the computation, but the data, right? Yeah. People, you can see organizations, different functions building their own vector database, right? You can quickly get out of control, right? If you don't really step back and think about the cost, right? Think about where the ROI is. And I'm starting to see a lot of the more sophisticated and more advanced organizations really starting to step back and think about it, right? Because what's interesting is during the experimentation phase, that token doesn't cost a lot, right? It's actually getting cheaper and cheaper, right? So people start to use it, they tried it, they feed in some initial data for proof of concepts. But if you start to deploy it at scale, you're going to still run into the same sort of cost challenges that people run into as they start to initially adopt cloud computing, right? Where it's a novelty, you're paying a variable cost, but at some point the costs get out of hand because you're using a lot of it without proper governance and control.
Yeah, Philip, and the last question would be, what geographic regions do you think that are emerging as key hotspots for AI data centers? And what are the factors that are driving that growth from your perspective?
Yeah, so what's very interesting is the initial phases of data center capacity build out is centered around where connectivity and access to land and energy is, right? Northern Virginia, Silicon Valley, over time into sort of Chicago, just because a lot of demand is there, Atlanta, right? But now more and more, especially for some of the larger scale training focused workload, right? Folks understand that, hey, you actually can, A, you need to build a lot of capacity, B, you need a lot of access to land, to connectivity and power. You're starting to see shifting it to sometimes the middle part of the country, right? Whether it's Kentucky, around Kansas City, just given access to connectivity there. You start to see places like Indiana also coming up, right? And Texas, right, for sure. But also markets that are close to traditional markets, like West Virginia versus Northern Virginia, right? It's another place that we're seeing. Indiana we talked about already, just because it's closer to Chicago, right? And then you start to see some of these. And a lot of local jurisdictions also recognize, right? They have access to land and power. It's a good place to attract, right? New construction activities, new sort of ways to drive jobs in the local jurisdiction. So you actually start to see some of these, I'd say, areas and regions that are outside of the traditional spots getting into the game, right, in terms of attracting. And some of these, like Stargate, for instance, right, they're putting money in Texas, they're putting money in some of the places that are non-traditional in that sense.
Well, that was Philip Wong from KPMG. So, Philip, thank you very much again for your time today. And thanks all for watching. And please stay tuned for more conversations on this critical space.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you for having me.